Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. For those of you watching live, you may notice that the show is a bit earlier today, and that's because our first topic today will be talking about load shedding, which is once again back to the dark days of stage 4. We haven't been at stage 4 for a while, but anyway, we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. I'm joined, of course, by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you in happy Cape Town?
Very well, thank you. Nice and sunny today, and slightly less load shedding, I think, than elsewhere in the country. But we'll talk about that in due course.
The sky is quite frankly apocalyptic up in Joburg here.
Oh, really?
Chris, how are you?
Nicholas and Michael are doing well, thanks. Let's see if we can weather the storm in the next half an hour and discuss the topics of the day before either Eskom or some other government force comes to shut us down. Let's see what happens.
Indeed. Right. So Eskom gave a briefing this morning about the load shedding and about the fact that we the load shedding kind of snuck up on us. First it was, oh guys, it's just going to be at night. And then suddenly it was, okay, actually it's going to be a stage 2 from now on. And then suddenly this morning it was, oops, stage 4. Sorry guys, we're not getting out of this at least until Monday. Is the analysis here. And Eskom has been doing these press conferences whenever there's sort of major load shedding to sort of explain what's going on. And for all my criticisms of Eskom, I must say I do appreciate this. It's much nicer to at least have a sort of, and they weren't as good at communication, I think, in the past. It's much better to at least know how bad the situation is. It helps us analyze the problems a bit better, and also it helps us plan, I think, a little bit more for the future. Anyway. So I don't think the CEO was there, but a lot of senior staff from Eskom were there just talking about some of the problems. So I think a very significant proportion of the total amount of Eskom's capacity, which is I think around 60,000 megawatts, I may be wrong on that, is out. There's about 20,000 of their total capacity is currently out. 15,000 of that is from breakdowns or unplanned outages, as they call them, and 5,000 is from planned outages. That's where you shut down the power plant to do maintenance to prevent a breakdown. So this explains why we've gotten to stage 4. As a result, the cause of these are various. There's been some mention of wet coal, which is this thing that comes up every single time. They say that they have plans in place to prevent wet coal and that it's not as much of a problem as it used to be. I'm glad that we seem to be slowly making progress towards solving a problem that happens every single year. But that's whatever. At least it's some sort of improvement, at least according to Eskom. They say that some of the outages are caused by the design issues, which continue to plague our 2 new coal power stations, Medupi and Kusile, which may I remind our listeners, when they were opened, Jacob Zuma said, we will never, ever have load shedding again. Well, and to supplement the incredible shortfall in electricity, they've been running these open cycle gas turbines, which are basically huge sort of diesel power generators, which are normally used at peak times to prevent load shedding, but recently they've been having to run them pretty much full time in order to keep the lights on. And just some stats on those, they cost 700,000 Rand per turbine per hour to run. I think there's like 3 or 4 of them. I may be wrong on that one, but I think that's the number. So that's millions of rands every hour to keep them running. They burn 9 million liters of diesel a day, 14 liters of diesel a second. And part of the reason that Eskom is saying that they have been doing stage 4 load shedding is to prevent even worse problems from low dam levels, which can reduce, I think, hydroelectricity, and of course, the current shortages in fuel and the spike in fuel prices around the world, at least partially related to the conflict in Ukraine. So, yeah, crazy stuff. Let me start with you, Michael. You at least have some reasons to be a little bit happy about this. At least not happy about this, but feel smugly superior to the rest of the country.
Indeed, and I kind of mentioned half in jest at the start that we're in a happier position. I've been sort of monitoring the City of Cape Town's very efficient website since earlier this morning, and we did start off, I think, at stage 1 throughout the day, but it's now stage 1, or was stage 1 from 5 until 10, and it's now stage 3 from 10 until 10 this evening. Whereas the rest of the country, I think, is universally pretty much on stage 4. So we certainly are in a better position, I think, than a lot of other people. And it's always. I know there've been arguments about who's really responsible for Cape Town being in a slightly better position than elsewhere, and there will be political point scoring, I guess, on both sides. But for whatever reason, there is a very basic truth here, and that's simply that it's just a better run place. It's more responsive to citizens. Whoever's been responsible for putting all these good things in place, it's been sustained, and the spirit of the enterprise is that we protect people as far as we can from the effects of load shedding. We'll keep people informed constantly. The website's very good. And I think the lesson to me is really quite simple, that until the real problems are confronted and the consequences will in fact remain the same. I think you make a very good point, that it's great that we have these regular briefings. I did notice if I was kind of smiled right into myself when I saw that Werberhall, so one of the officials, I forget his first name now, who has been doing the briefing, made reference to the fact that Andre de Ruyter is in fact in Washington, and there's this little comment in reported speech. He says de Ruyter trusts them to run Eskom properly when he is not around, and of course we can be fairly sure that these individuals are doing their best. But the issue,
I should hope so.
Indeed. But in fact, the real issue is that the ANC government is standing in the way of the brutal, economically obvious solutions, without which South Africa is not going to have enough power. And I think it comes down to that.
So, of course, one of the things that seems to be coming out of this is that the potential for stage 6 load shedding, which we've had it once before, I think, back before everyone knew there was a stage 6. What was it, 2 or 3 years ago? No, it was in 2019, I believe. And that is on the cards, Eskom says, if things deteriorate any further, which, considering the fact that it's still raining and we might get more wet cold, maybe there will be. Chris, to me, a lot of the story of what's going on in places like Cape Town is we're really seeing the benefits of decentralization. These local governments have made an effort to do what they can to make their own plans, to add power to the grid that's got nothing to do with the national grid. And as a result, when the national grid fails due to incompetence of management or just bad luck, you actually have someone to try and pick up the slack and make it less worse. Your thoughts on our current bout of load shedding, sir?
I think one can extrapolate your point to the broader South African economic context where, yes, there's global events happening, global forces impacting on us, for example, increased fuel price, oil price, etc. But because of our own policy choices the last 10 to 15 years, we're in a much weaker position than we ideally could be. So now, for example, we could benefit from increased commodities prices, but if we keep getting load shedding, then is mining and agriculture really going to be able to operate to optimal efficiency? We still have the enforced monopoly in rail and ports that is Transnet, so it'll be more difficult for exporters to get their goods out of the country. I know there's all sorts of technical discussions and problems with having a lot of people feeding into the grid and taking out of it, and then you have sort of reliability issues, that sort of thing. But I think the point of at least provincial decentralization should be understood and carried forward. I mean, last year we had the big announcement around the lifting of the threshold for self-generation without a license to 100 megawatts, and that was widely hailed as one of the big sort of structural reform points that has been called for repeatedly, and now it might actually happen. But it's very difficult still for people to get a permit. You still need to get a permit. So you can operate without a license, but you need a permit. And it sounds like NERSA and the Department of Energy and Minerals is making that process exceedingly difficult. So you see government again hitting up against its own ideological constraints, sort of the ideological chains holding it back, because that's serious power, not just literally, but political, figurative power, taking away from government's idea that it needs to command, control, and centrally manage something as important as electricity distribution and generation. So yeah, I mean, if we can give anyone advice, if you can, it's always a good idea to get somewhat off the grid. If you can't afford a massive generator, at least some sort of backup battery pack or something like that, so you can work for 2 hours when you couldn't at all. And that sort of idea of isolating and making yourself less fragile to the failures of the state, I think will serve you well, despite all the speeches and summits that President Ramaphosa might throw at us every now and then.
Indeed. I think, one thing I do just want to say on the point of complexity, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, is, these systems are actually extremely complex. And I think people not in the engineering or whatever industry, the electricity industry, will think to themselves, it can't be that hard, can it? Well, I mean, it often is. Doesn't mean that people aren't making stupid mistakes, but these things do tend to be extremely complicated. And when it comes to the solutions, sometimes I think we do have to have at least a little bit of deference for some of those details, which in the general policy discussion, I think sometimes get washed over.
It also it just shows how, because we've had this trend the last 20 years, I'd argue, of the state and the economy becoming ever more mixed. And now as we try and do reforms and try and untangle that web, the stakes are so high. I mean, for the state to surrender that sort of power, again, not just literally, but it's going to take a lot of will and maybe economic devastation to actually get to that point. So it just shows you when you centralize so much and give the state that sort of oversight, it becomes ever more, the incentives for reform become ever lower, because it just matters about how connected you are in politics.
Right. Imagine you have a massive weight suspended instead of from many ropes from one single rope. It becomes almost impossible to take it off and then put on a new attachment to prevent it falling because it's holding everything up. Michael, any final thoughts on this?
I certainly endorse everything that's been said, and the phrase that I was thinking of this morning is this idea of policy indifference, and it's indifference not just to the effects of policy on citizens, but in fact indifference to economic reality. But it does become the penalties of sustaining that indifference mount for the longer that you do so, and it just becomes harder. And more costly in some ways to reverse the path.
Exactly, and I just want to say that even for the optimists amongst us, I just want to echo Chris's point on getting yourself off the grid if you can, because it's unlikely to get better. At least even if we started doing all of the right things tomorrow, it's going to take years to fix the problems with Eskom because they are very deep. Even doing exactly what I want to do with Eskom would still take a long time to fix it, unfortunately. So make a plan in the meantime. That's what South Africans are good at, and hopefully sooner than later we will. I hope that before I'm an old man, I will see the end of load shedding. That's my sincere hope. Anyway, let us move on to our next story, which is related to the first, actually, and this is worries that the price of fuel is going to be going way up in the next couple of days. An SA taxi owner, Transaction Capital, has published a trading update ahead of its AGM, saying that they think that there's going to be there's a very high chance of increased transport costs in the coming months. At the end of 2021, the 12-month average for petrol and diesel prices were 19% and 17% higher than a year ago, and the petrol prices broken the 20 rand a litre level. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is certainly not making this any easier, because the sanctions being imposed on Russia, a major oil exporter, are certainly causing problems, and the just general instability, I think, is also causing some panic in the markets. So I guess it's time to talk a little bit about the fuel price in general. It's a lot of countries in the world are suffering from these problems. It's not just South Africa. Chris, what can government actually do to try and remedy the situation in the short and medium term?
Well, I'll use the P word about privatizing the road accident fund, because a lot of the fuel price, a lot of the taxes that form part of the fuel price are used, for example, go towards the road accident fund and other taxes and levies. Now you wonder, I'm sure a lot of South African citizens would not mind if paying their taxes if their taxes were actually used efficiently and well. So if the road accident fund actually performed well, if it didn't need constant sort of bailouts and other forms of assistance, you would actually argue, hey, maybe it's not that bad. But that's one thing I would argue, is at
Well,
least
just on
removing.
that point, Fikile Mbalula, I believe, said yesterday that the backlog in maintenance for fixing South Africa's roads is around 200 billion rands. So I'm not sure quite what we're paying the taxes for.
No, precisely, good point. And that, I mean, on the one hand, it undermines an already shrinking tax base and incentivizes people to not pay tax. And then on the other hand, it I think lowers trust and confidence in the state, which is why you more and more you hear people talking about South Africa as a failing state, which when the IRR did it, then of course it's sort of sensationalist, right wing, etc., etc. But now it's becoming, I mean, the facts simply support that sort of analysis. So that's one point. Sorry, with the road accident fund is removing some of those taxes and levies that are used. Another point would simply again be allowing private sector investment and skills development in rail and harbors, because then transport companies could again use railway, for example, lessening the pressure on the roads, which would lower the amount that government would need to spend on upgrading roads and maintaining them. For example, we wouldn't see as many trucks on the roads. That's a sort of downstream effect that could happen. And then finally, and this is obviously a big wish item, but having the sort of policy environment that encourages more investment, especially in terms of petroleum, in exploiting those resources. As we know, at the end of this month, the SAPREF facility in Durban will be mothballed, and I would argue that indicates great concern on the part of the people who own that in terms of South Africa's policy framework moving forward. When you have these sorts of facilities in your country, you're better able to weather global forces, for example, again, the increase of the oil price, and then those effects won't be passed on to your citizens and consumers. So now with this taxi sort of announcement of a price increase as a result of fuel prices, again, it affects the poorest to middle income citizens the most, who rely on that form of transport. Now, the taxi drivers and owners have to pass on those costs to someone, and unfortunately, it's those people who need to use it the most. After 2 years of lockdowns and people trying to find some kind of work and having to move around and using taxis because they can't rely on rail transport, for example, you're pushing them into a very difficult position where they have to make ever more desperate sort of trade-offs between their everyday economic choices.
It's interesting you brought up the failed state thing, and of course, Neil Froneman, the CEO of Sibanye-Stillwater, one of South Africa's most important mining business leaders, said that South Africa is nearly a failed state recently. Michael, you had some thoughts on this that we talked about in the pre-show discussion. Do you want to expand on those?
Indeed. And tying together actually a number of strands that both you and Chris have raised. I think Chris is absolutely right about the P word, the private sector. And this, just is a month after Ramaphosa stood up in Parliament and suggested to the country that he was putting his faith in private sector dynamism. And that the private sector is going to lead the economic revival and jobs and so on, which is quite right. But it then has to be followed through with the policy thrust.
And he sort of back in his letter the next morning, the next Monday.
I know. So one never really knows with verbal statements. I mean, it does, and this and so we then come to Neil Froneman. Talking very bluntly, he paints a stark picture. He says weak government leadership has created the problem and is doing nothing about it because of ideology. It has neither the capacity nor the competence to deal with the problem. And so he says that businesses will have to start spending more to build and maintain their own municipal and government services, as the government will not be capable of providing these reliably going forward. And I think I was kind of thinking to myself, there's almost as if there's a difference between a failed state and a failed country. We're not necessarily a failed country because that private sector is as Business Day editorial today, I think, said, remarkably resilient. It's thriving despite the odds. The two sectors that have produced this astonishing economic support to the economy, with the fastest growing sectors in 2021, are mining and agriculture. And that these are the two sectors that the government is really hammering with, one mining charter after the next, all sorts of onerous demands and impositions, which in turn limit the scale of that industry to respond quickly to, for instance, fuel and prospecting and oil and gas possibilities and opportunities. And then the other, of course, is agriculture, which is, right in the government's sights in the context of so-called land reform, but it's really just taking stuff that belongs to other people without paying for it, and undermining the entire economic proposition of the country. So we do have all these things sort of coming together: failed state. There is this resilience, but it's just a burden being chronically held back quite needlessly, and that coming back to a point that Chris raised, it comes down ultimately as this greatest burden onto the poor and kind of low middle class people, who are the majority. I think through all of this, we have a country that could be a powerhouse but isn't, and quite needlessly so, because of all these interventions and impositions.
So there's just 2 points I want to make. The first is an element of pushback on our reducing the fuel levies and taxes and things will be to say, look, that's all just very nice to say, but the problem is the country relies on those very heavily at the moment for filling some of the fiscal holes that we're in. Yeah, that's true. But firstly, it's quite a painful tax because it does hurt economic activity. It drives up inflation, things like that, because it makes the cost of moving anything around more. And secondly, we get to a point where bad policy decisions in one area are being used to justify bad policy decisions in another area, which is just, this is just the sort of spiral of death. It's like, yeah, I guess we could keep raising the taxes forever on everything until there's no more economic activity in the country. Doesn't seem like a particularly long-term solution. So I also see in the comments there's some discussion about the price of oil sort of globally. And I do think there is probably something South Africa could do on this front. It turns out the past couple of years, we've discovered an enormous amount of gas and oil and things either close to South Africa, off the coast of Namibia, or in South Africa's territorial waters, or even in the Karoo. Now, for a variety of reasons, a lot of the stuff there's been very little development on it. Some of it is due to government policy incompetence, which is definitely holding that back. But a lot of it is also actually due to the fact that people are very worried about the environmental effects. And I think that this is a discussion that needs to be had more honestly in South Africa, is what we are losing by blocking some of these projects. Chris, that's a contentious issue. I'm sure there's people in our audience who are very annoyed by that statement, but what do you make of what I just said?
Yeah, definitely not. I wouldn't consider myself, well, I'm only an expert on foreign policy, trade, property rights, rule of law, etc., but not an expert on environmental matters. But that being said, there is an argument that when people become more economically free and affluent, they're better able to take care of the environment around them. When property rights are stronger, when the rule of law is stronger, people take responsibility for the environment. They establish trusts and other ways of taking care of animals and sort of natural resources. That's tragedy of the commons idea. When the state owns everything, or everyone owns everything, then no one really owns anything and no one takes the steps necessary to protect it. So I will just say that I'm fairly certain that if we had more pro-economic freedom policies, we would see the consequent increase in quality of life and economic prosperity, and then people would be better enabled to take care of those in the sort of hierarchy of values, those values that maybe they can't focus on when they're desperately trying to find food or employment or take care of their kids, or that kind of daily struggle that's caused by the current draconian policies of the government.
Briefly, Michael, your thoughts on that aspect of the problem?
I was in fact going to make exactly the same point. And I think our colleague on the Daily Friend, Ivor Ficht, has written quite substantially on this, quite extensively on it, and I would certainly recommend people having a look at his pieces on that topic. But essentially, the proposition that economic growth and development and sophistication goes with environmental protection, which is in fact voluntary, and it's part and parcel of successful societies that they look after the environment they live in.
All right, we're running low on time here, so let's move on to our last story for today, and that is that it's not just the middle class, the poor in South Africa who are currently going through difficult financial times. There's been an interesting bit of data released by the credit bureau Experian, which does this thing called the Consumer Default Index, which basically looks at how many people are defaulting on loans they take out. And obviously, the number of people defaulting on loans since the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns has gone way up, and it started to come down in last quarter of 2021. However, what's interesting is that the richest segment, the so-called luxury living segment, it's about 2.5% of South African people, have seen a 7% deterioration in how often they're paying their loans. This is a group, so it's quite a small increase in absolute numbers. This group has gone from 2.3% of the time defaulting on loans. This is things like car loans, house loans, stuff like that, to about 7.5%. Now, you might think, oh, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But firstly, this is an important part of the segment of the population because it pays a huge amount of our taxes. They earn a lot. They pay a lot of tax. And secondly, this is generally the most financially stable part of the population. This is, doctors, lawyers, investment bankers, the kind of upper middle class or the elite. And when they start defaulting on loans, I mean, I'm not a financial expert, but it makes me go a bit, ugh. It's the only word I have for it. Chris, briefly, your thoughts.
I suppose if one is on a path of pure redistributionism, once you disincentivize wealth creation, you run out of wealth to redistribute. So all of those social compacts and plans and social solidarity that the state and other NGOs often talk about and value, and they have good reasons for valuing those things, all of that needs to be funded somehow. And for example, a basic income grant, even that'll remain very much pie in the sky for as long as South Africa pursues anti-wealth creation ideas and policies. There's a passage in Atlas Shrugged, which, it's sort of declining society, etc., etc., and then it mentions the breaking of a copper wire, and that again precipitates the sort of it concretizes the ideas and the effects of the policies on people's everyday lives. So once the actual things start breaking, how difficult it is for people to sort of actually live productive lives anymore. So the fact that now it's starting to affect, that South Africa's policies are starting to really affect more upper class people, you wonder where the breaking point, if there will be one, and when it will come. And it's also, I think, worth remembering, yes, they might be experiencing a bit of a squeeze, but a lot of more affluent people are still better able to go overseas to get better services and resources and that kind of thing. Whereas for poorer South Africans, they're forced to sit here with the destructive effects of the government's policies. So if we get things like NHI, for example, richer South Africans can still go overseas while others have to be forced to sit here and deal with the hand they've been dealt.
Right, do surgery with a hacksaw and a bottle of vodka. Michael, your thoughts in about 30 seconds or so on this.
Right, yeah, I agree entirely with Chris's points and the ones you've raised. I think there's a funny kind of natural disdain perhaps for the rich among all those who are not necessarily rich. And question rises in some people's minds, why do we need to care? Well, we need to care because these are likely very productive people. They're best placed to be able to employ others, very likely to be capable of creating and running businesses and so on. So to lose them or to see them being weakened is a harbinger for a crisis that goes much deeper.
Very well said, sir. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.